Message, Gail. All right, we are going to get started here, I think, and proceed now with our webinar for today. So thank you everyone for joining today. I'm Catherine Shao. Some of you know me. I lead the sales enablement practice here at Oxygen, and I'm going to be your host for today's virtual experience. Just a little bit about Oxygen. We help companies drive growth by modernizing sales enablement and workplace education. And we've been designing and delivering modern and experiential learning programs for years. But I do think we'd all agree that this past year has presented some very unique and new challenges around the kind of interpersonal interaction and learning at work that needs to happen, particularly for our customer-facing people. So I know everybody has Zoom and webinar fatigue potentially. So let's just get dynamic very quickly. We're going to share a conversation with you today, as well as some nice imagery to look at as we dive into this topic of how marketing and sales need to work together to drive success in 2021. So today's speakers, you can see them on camera here, are Oxygen CEO Juliana Stancompiano and Tad Harmon, who is the founder and CEO of and Chief Creative Officer at Union. Just a little bit about our speakers. Juliana is our Oxygen experience guru when it comes to workplace learning, particularly for sellers and those customer-facing teams who are out there every day, virtually, of course, in many cases, and thinking about how do we help them succeed and learn new things on their jobs. So it's great to have you here today, Juliana.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this discussion or maybe lots of disagreements with Tad.
Great. And I'll introduce Tad as well. Tad is the founder and CEO of Team Union. And for the last 30 years, he has been an agency creative leader, an entrepreneur, a storyteller, and a brand strategist. Definitely well-versed in the integration of multiple marketing disciplines and currently serves as an advisor to both enterprise brand leaders and startups. So welcome, Tad.
Happy to be here. And I feel like this is going to be that Uber Eats commercial where I'm going to have the 4-cheese tortellini with tomatoes.
Well, that sounds delicious. Wish I hadn't just eaten lunch.
Seen that commercial in that, but that's what this makes me think of.
Excellent. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions at all, everybody's actually on mute, just for the purposes of doing a virtual meeting here. But if you have questions, go ahead, type them in either the question box in your Zoom chat window, or use the Zoom chat, or use the Q&A box, either one, and we will address them as we go along. We'll also have plenty of time toward the end for any of those other longer questions that require discussion. So let's get into it and bridge the chasm of chaos. And I'm going to just go ahead by putting this next statement in front of you all here. And we're going to start with Juliana here to talk to us about what is making things so complicated for marketing and sales.
Yeah, so this has been a discussion that I've been a part of in many different arenas for quite some time. It feels like probably most of us have that are on and listening. And then I would say this year, especially, it got exacerbated. And I think we saw that through a lot of the work that we do, because all of a sudden messaging had to shift fast. Imagery had to shift fast. Learning had to shift fast, right? Everything had to make shifts faster this year than we've ever had to in the last number of years. And we jokingly have said about some of the work that we've done with clients, I've never seen them throw decks our way that look so bad because they were trying to just help their sellers with, the pivot that was being made across many different industries. And so I think we all, know how much has been changing and coming. And yet I think it presents an opportunity that we're going to see more and more in 2021 of the overlap between sales and marketing. And we've been seeing it coming, and I think it came really fast this year. So I don't know, Tad, what your lens is from a different perspective.
Well, the first thing I was going to say, is there anybody else out there that doesn't want to hear the word pivot anymore? I have pivot fatigue. Nothing personal, but it's, I would just say, looking at this part about developing new narratives is something that, I focus on and our group focuses on, because with every change, people have to kind of, change their story in midstream. And if they don't get the narrative right, a lot of times it gets passed down or doesn't get passed down. And I think, on top of the normal sort of sales and marketing chasm, having to have both groups understand these new narratives, it's just yet another burden, let alone everything, you're talking about collaborating and bonding. And I think everybody by now is probably pretty used to digital conferencing and things, but it's yet another barrier to saying you can't get in a room together yet and do the brainstorm and the personal dialogue. So yeah, it's a tough time. I'm sure everybody out there, no matter what you do, agrees.
Yeah, I would add as well that I think leaders are expecting more collaboration across organizations right now, and people really come together to help one another in ways that we maybe didn't feel we had to, before. I'm going to try to not use all these words that everybody's pointing out, but now it's going to be really difficult. Before the pandemic hit and our life went virtual and selling went virtual and marketing went, fully virtual, and all the things that we've been through.
Yep. Yeah, I think it is interesting, and we're going to continue to explore and potentially even, as I move into this next thing. So you've touched on it a little. The customers in 2021 are expecting quite a bit. And there's this idea of personalization. And I'd really love to hear both of you talk a little bit more about, like, if you're a seller in particular, like, what does it mean to personalize? Because if you're having conversations with people, aren't you already doing that? And so where do sellers come from as opposed to marketing? Maybe Juliana, you can start with that question.
Yeah, I think in the conversations that I've been having, this personalization keeps coming up over and over and over again. And it's really interesting, depending on kind of what industry somebody's in, personalization can mean different things to different people. And you hear people in the technology space start talking about AI and the data that is being gathered so that they can do more personalization. And I think as a customer and a consumer, which all of us are on these calls, we want things to be talking to us, not to be talking to everybody, right? And so how do we hone in on that messaging? And we've had this discussion a lot at Oxygen. It's like there's marketing that from our view is like this one-to-many, but how do you make a one-to-many message sound personal to somebody? Or is it this one-to-few? And that's a lot of work and a lot of lift for an organization to create many different messages to the one-to-fewer on that scale. And so I think this is what we're going to have to navigate this year, and really figuring out how to do it. And that's a lot of what I'm curious to talk about today, is how do we approach this and work together in 2021? Because what I'm seeing is that leaders are expecting this to start happening, and it feels like there's some magic bridge. It's a little bit like the first picture that we had up, and there's like this magic bridge that just goes over, the Grand Canyon, and you can just walk across it and have everything that everybody needs between marketing and sales. And I have yet to find the magic bridge.
Well, I would just add, yes. Marketers have been going towards the route of being more personal for years and trying to make more efficient and effective media buys. And of course, there's social media that invites ways to, almost invasively be personalizing messages and target. But in the enterprise, and when you talk about our theme for today, as Juliana said, it truly is marketers start with how do we build awareness and generate leads with the most people possible, which is a one-to-many message. And as they're thinking of their media spends and they're thinking about how to reach customers, a lot of times the conversation doesn't extend or isn't thoughtful of the sellers. They're thinking more about media and more about the end user than they are about the people that are their teammates.
Yeah, I think something that we have been discussing as well and thinking through is it's great to have that message that's one to many, but you can't take that message on a call with a client and you're one-to-one and you're looking at them just like we're looking at each other here, that doesn't create a conversation to last very long.
Right.
And I think that that is in part the struggle for sellers is they have a cadence and a series of conversations and interaction types that happen with their customers, and they need fodder and help with that whole cadence, not just getting in. And I think that that's where a lot of the personalization and customization comes into play. And we've been having this debate of like, whose job is that to make sure that that happens?
That's a great point, Juliana, and we will touch on that as well. I think to kind of reiterate the one-to-many sort of aspect of marketing and how marketing views the world, and yet we still have words like personas coming from marketing, and these sort of ways in which marketing is trying to get more granular or more targeted, and yet like at the same time, it seems like no matter how granular marketing gets, you can't take that with you to a sales conversation necessarily. So there's something improvisational almost about what sales has to do and what sellers have to do every day that that's hard for marketing to just sort of codify that or hard code it, if you will.
Well, it's interesting that it's interesting, Catherine, that you bring up the word persona, because I remember how excited I was years ago, the first time I said, oh, we're going to look at personas and really get to know who our customer is. And, it sometimes almost does people and marketers and sellers a disservice, because in those moments of trying to define, they sometimes end up generalizing the persona. And so you almost go the other way from personalization, because you have this pressure to think, well, how do we paint this picture and how do we reach that? But today, as we know, the culture and it's just everybody is so different, has different interests. It almost flies opposite to what we need.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's why it's hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's why we make the big bucks.
We keep trying to make it easy, and there's nothing really easy about it.
Yeah. And I think to that point, I'm gonna move us into this next slide, which shows just how hard it is. Given the data that we've seen, this 65% of content that's created is not used is a pretty big number, and so what's being created for sellers is missing the mark. And I don't know even that number has changed. I mean, we've been watching this from Serious Decisions for a while, and Juliana, I don't know what you're seeing, but like we haven't seen this number change a whole lot.
Hey, by the way, Juliana, sorry to cut you off, but I just, Juliana and I have known each other for years and years, and I've even helped her with some branding things and talked to her, and we kind of have our less filming, better taste kind of arguments from here and there. But to be honest to all of you and transparent, I was never clear on what the hell Juliana and Catherine did, because they would talk in terms that like sales enablement and learning, and I just never really clicked in. But I gotta say that this slide is what triggered our, sort of a closer relationship. When I saw that figure, it's sort of shattering to think that there are all these people working their asses off to do all this content. They think that they're helping, and to think that 65% of it is a waste is just, that's what caught my eye to this whole industry. It's crazy.
Yeah, so I think everybody would Tad would like everybody to know that he's responsible for the 3 rings in the Oxygen logo.
Despite the color changes over the years.
Exactly. It's not the same, but it is still the same.
It has more meaning now, though. We can talk on that later.
Exactly. So when I first actually showed this to Tad and talked to him about sales enablement and the work that we were doing, this did really resonate with him. And I think all of us as people that create content were like, oh, shoot, this is maybe not good because we're here and creating stuff as well. So how do we not become part of the 65%? I did verify with Heather right before she left Forrester and Serious Decisions that this number hasn't shifted this year, because it was from a number that was the previous conference. which so we continue to use it because it makes a statement, right? And it makes the point when we are talking to clients and about the things that are being made. And when you think about the continuum of stuff that's made for sellers, that starts all the way from marketing and flows through sales enablement and learning and development and everybody else that's creating stuff for sellers, we have wondered a lot about, well, why is the content that's created not used for sellers? And I think, we've done a lot of research into this as well. And there's, as I said, there's different points on the continuum. I think from a marketing standpoint, sometimes what's created is not specific enough. It's maybe not relevant to the conversations that sellers are having. And so that's why that is maybe not being used. Or, part of the struggle we've had ourselves is that static document that you can't edit. And if you need to edit it and make a few adjustments so that it can be used for the client conversation, then you have to go back to the person that created it, ask them to make these edits, and it starts to become slow. And I think that's another reason why the different types of content don't get used.
That's why we use Adobe products like InDesign so you guys can't mess with their product.
Yeah, I think that's intentional, right? So
Right.
it's like, yes, and we mean for it to not be edited. So there's total truth to that. And what do we do then if it's not being used, right? I would then go to say that there's then different pieces of content from the learning side or the enablement side, or different assets that are created that are still not being used because they're not easy to find, they're not relevant in that specific moment for the seller, they're too long, they're too boring. There's so many different aspects that go into it. How do you create stuff and content that's relevant at the time of need for the sellers? And I think that's really the question I think a lot of us are asking.
It does really get into the friction because the seller is left with nothing to do but try to do it itself, do it themselves. And I think therein lies this problem. And I think if more leaders were aware of how much time and energy is wasted, they would probably figure out a way to change it.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Nope, you go.
Oh, I was just going to double down on it. We've been a part of so many conversations when we ask the sellers, well, we haven't seen this deck that you're using. Can you tell us where it came from? Or we haven't seen this thing. And they say, oh, it's something we created. We're keeping it on our internal SharePoint. That's like, you just do a facepalm moment in that and want to help and make that accessible. And then it's like, well, where do you store all your stuff? And as many sales enablement tools that are out there, content management tools that are out there, a lot of times that we hear SharePoint.
Yeah. I want to get us back into this conversation about where sales comes from and where marketing comes from, because there is a role, a little foreshadowing here, a little role for sales enablement to play in this, but let's talk about these differences in perspective between sales and marketing here just for a minute, and sort of ask that sort of why can't we all get along question, because it's not like we're saying that marketing is terrible, because they're very, very, very good at that, broadcasting the message, at some of the creative polish, at some of the other things that they do. And, sales is obviously going to have that conversation with a customer and be able to improvise like nobody's business. The really good sellers will do that. So let's talk a little bit more about these types of differences.
Well, we added that little note at the bottom where I think it's become de rigueur to be polarized these days. It's like we call it the new black. And indeed, marketing and sales can be polarized because, from its essence, the marketer is going to, let's just say they're responsible for a product that's coming out. They want to lead product management. They don't want to follow product management. So marketing takes control and says, look, we have this knowledge of the marketplace and we want to create a brand. And they get somewhat precious about the brand to a fault. And I think, they, in order to enforce the brand, they build brand guidelines, and they insist that throughout the enterprise, you don't mess with the brand guidelines. And then they're shocked when the salespeople say, well, this isn't, I can't use this. It's not just not even relevant. And the marketers go, well, how can that be? I mean, we've studied the personas, we've talked to the product people. So, I think that's, people, like I said, it's kind of funny, but I think people are willing to be almost more polarized in their expectations and demands. But I don't know that, as we say, why is this so difficult? I don't know that anybody wants to change.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, Catherine, you have an antivirus thing up on your screen, just so you know.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for letting me know.
You're welcome.
I can't see it in my other view.
I agree with that. And I think, I saw what Paco put in the comments as well. I think there's some truth to that of potentially marketers are too far away from the customer, right? And sellers are driving an antiquated message and working to be more consultative. I think there's some truth to that. The other thing that I'm consistently talking about, it seems like with the leaders that we work with, is asking how people are rewarded. And a lot of how people act and what people do at work is driven by performance management. And, being a consultant, you learn very early on, the first thing you need to ask your customer is, what does success look like for you personally? Because you need to know the person's being driven by something that they're trying to do to create success for the company. And I personally think that those performance management metrics or conversations or whatever it is that you use in your company need to be looked at to make sure that they're additive versus, creating more of the chasm. And we've run into this within product marketing so many times, where we're having a discussion with product marketing, with sales, with product marketing, and we're trying to understand what to create that's going to be helpful for the sellers. And we continue to hear product marketing say, do you need this in this format? Can we create it in this format? Can we create you a, and it's like, you're not listening. We need, you're not listening to the conversation that we're trying to have with the client and then figuring out what the right way is. But that's how they're being driven from a performance management perspective. And so they're really, really anxious about providing that so that they can be seen as doing their job. And we need more conversations about what it is and how we're being driven so that we can help one another, as well as, further the conversation with the client to close the deal, which is what the company really wants, is to drive the revenue.
I love Paco's comment, by the way.
Yeah, that's great. Yep. Well, I think so. Just to kind of talk through more of these two extremes, I'm going to put up kind of our next slide has, I think, some strong language in here to draw this contrast. And as Juliana and Tad are discussing their perspectives and these different perspectives, I would love to hear more from the folks on the webinar. If you take a look at these and then give us some points of view in the chat, or as part of that, of do you agree, do you disagree with these characterizations of the cerebral marketer and the visceral seller? I think these are interesting points, and we're kind of drawing a contrast here because we, we're going to get to a new point in a couple more slides. But Tad, Juliana, I mean, what are some of your thoughts about these broad differences?
I think Paco might have said it even clearer than this, and obviously we're trying to point to the extremes at the polar ends, but the cerebral marketer I'll speak to, but it's to Paco's point. I think marketers take pride in being more relevant and more modern in their thinking, and that's because if they're doing their job, they're going to have a data-driven campaign or data-driven brand, and then they figure out how that's going to drive awareness and stimulate interest and generate leads, and that's a big task. So come on, sellers, get on it. And I don't know that, I think, that's, I think, an opinion and an impression that isn't accurate at all. but they might see the sellers as just being lazy and not trying hard enough to make the things work because we were so smart in the way that we created them.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting as we did these slides because I did the perception of the seller and Tad did the perception of the marketer. So it's interesting because we've heard these like feedbacks from the other side, right? Many times. And I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, maybe they're just lazy. And I think it's more than that. And I think this is where you're right. These are like, it's like you can put these on top of countries, right? And generalize a whole population and decide that this is how they are. This is kind of what we've done with these two roles within organizations. And there's typically some truth to them. And then there's a lot of people that don't fit in either one of these categories. And so how do we get rid of these perceptions that are maybe old or faulty and think about what we're both trying to do and how we try to drive this? And for whatever reason, even as we've done it ourselves in Oxygen, there can be some really heated debates. And how do we be okay with that and work through those debates? Because on the other side of them comes moments of clarity and alignment and the good things that we want to be driving. But, you know, as somebody who's sold my whole career, I have absolutely felt like this person in the blue, where I'm out in the trenches, I'm in front of the customer, there's expectations on me. I need these things and I'm asking for help, and my requests for help don't seem to be heard. And that's such a shocking thing when you're like, no, I just need X, because I can visualize the conversation with the customer that I need to have to get the next conversation or to get the ask to be a part of the work that they're doing. And so, you know, how do we bring that together and have a more common language that we're using so that we can both drive leads and brand and awareness, but also help drive those customer conversations down?
Well, I think what Juliana is saying is actually sort of why we've had such a long relationship and why we understand both sides, ironically, and it's because we've had our own businesses, we've been leaders, and everybody's selling, right? We're all selling at a certain point. And, you know, who hasn't been on the front line where they're presenting to a leadership group? And whether you're from my side, your side, or whatever, if you don't have it right and it doesn't resonate, you're embarrassed and you just want to go home. And so I think, you know, there's empathy for the seller here, I'll just say, because, you know, I've been there many times, and obviously Juliana has as well. And there's some really nice people setting up our next slide out there. If you,
yes, I was gonna. Yes, actually, that's a great transition.
Did we plant that? Did we plant those?
Yeah, this is great. So yeah, the enter sales enablement. I mean, this is kind of where the whole conversation is headed, is that, you know, maybe marketing doesn't have to necessarily change everything they do, or sales can't change everything they do, but that there's somebody in the middle there that's actually helping bring the best of both worlds together. Julianne, you want to say a little bit about this and maybe some of the things that are being said over chat as well?
Yeah, I love what Tashna's put in there. So I like that, the term, the translation, like we talk a lot about being the translation layer in an organization with sales enablement, you know, of translating the business strategy, the marketing work, whatever it is, into things that are going to really enable sellers to go have those conversations, get the next ones, drive their pipelines forward and drive revenue for the company. So, you know, all of these things and the words that are on this slide resonate in my mind from how we've created sales enablement structures or helped organizations drive sales enablement. That's very helpful. And, you know, and I think it's interesting because one of our clients said, you know, the empathy that you have for sellers is extremely high. And I think part of why Tad and I have gotten along for so many years is because he's a selling marketer, right? So he's got that lens of he's out in front of the clients, and he's also creating the brand and the narrative. Back, you know, we also have our jobs of what we do for the client once we've done the sales. I do a lot of the learning architecture side, or the org design side, and the consulting side of what we do. But you have to have the conversations, and you have to sell what's possible first. And we've both been a part of that. And having somebody that can help translate what's happening in those customer conversations, how it relates to the brand, how it relates to the messaging and the story that you want to tell, and bringing that together, I think is an incredibly powerful part of an organization to have.
Well, as I get more enrolled in Catherine and Juliana's expertise, and I do understand the sales enablement side of or they're not the side, they're the middle, right? In the core, that function, these guys invited me, so they let me sort of put words in on this slide that I don't know if they're absolutely typical of a sales enablement conversation. I mean, that may or may not be, but I do think, since the title of this is we want to bridge the chasm. The underlying title, though, is we want to drive more success in 2021. And so I think, purposefully, there's more expectation on sales enablement. Like, I'm not even positive that's the right title anymore. And what that does is, I think for those sales enablers out there who understand that there is the need, no question. But I think it's not only translation, it's actually really, you're almost a creator yourself. You have to be able to take the pass down, say, from the brand guidelines and shape them in a way that it's meaningful for the sellers without it losing the story. Because I think, to Paco's comment, which I still like, if the sellers are 20 years behind and they're used to their same way of selling and language, and I'm in a relationship, we're going to play golf and have a few beers and I'll close the deal. Well, I think that's the job of the enablers, to make this a more sophisticated process as much as possible. And part of being sophisticated means it's simplified, which is what the last line there is. Marketers and especially in the enterprise, marketers and salespeople are just famous for this language, this speak that has to be on their slides and it has to be in their meetings and everything. And part of the deal about why can't we all get along? Well, why can't we all just talk in human terms? And I think customers will embrace and relate to that as well. So, the bottom line of this slide is there's marketing and sales. They're now, it's like the Reese's peanut butter cup. They're kind of glued together. But the most important thing is that bottom line, in a way, is that they have a forum for providing input and listening. And I think, if I was just to say one thing that sales enablement needs to do, is provide that forum. And it's not easy, but I think that's been the missing link.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is that, and Catherine and I have had this discussion because she and I have played this role of facilitating meetings many, many times between different stakeholders. And when you're more Switzerland in these meetings, and you don't have something that an agenda you're trying to drive, or something that you think is the right way, etc., and you just show up and you listen and you ask the questions and you dig a little bit deeper and you dig a little bit deeper and you hear what sales leaders have to say, and you hear what marketing leaders have to say, and you hear what the strategy side or the operations side, and you start to pull these different threads together. I think a huge part of our role is to facilitate that discussion so that you can get to what the right path forward is for not just one person, but for everybody. Because I think that the funny part about this is, when we first started setting this up, I said to Tad, I said, well, what do you think marketing's role is? And he said, to drive revenue. And I said, well, what do you think sales thinks their role is? And it was like, if we have the same goal, how come it's so hard to get there together? And, I think it's a great question. And I've talked to many other marketers. In fact, I just talked to a lady yesterday who has a company that's very specifically in this kind of account-based marketing space, but like small group account-based marketing type of work. And she said, our goal is to drive revenue. And I said, that's so interesting, because that seems to be what everybody's goal is. And yet we're all coming at it from such different angles. And I asked her, I said, who do you sell into and who buys what you do? And she said, sales. And I thought that was interesting as well, right? So she's being brought in by sales leaders to drive really what Sirius calls conversation ready leads, which is being able to almost qualify something for a salesperson to specifically know what the conversation is going to be about. And so what I'm also seeing in this is more and more of that overlap in the middle. And we keep having the conversations about, when does it go from like big scale from a marketing perspective into a smaller funnel, right? And you into the leads that are kind of in this mixed place, and there's this handoff to sales. And I feel like that's the spot that we struggle with the most of how to work together. And Catherine, I'd kind of love to know your perspective on this from, your sales enablement background, as well as the work that we've been doing.
I mean, I think it is very interesting and we've long talked about sales enablement as being a function that's a strategic function, an elevated function. We talked about elevating sales enablement and things of that nature. And I think characterizing sales enablement as that go-between is potentially that aspect of it that is a little new and different. And also, like, if you're thinking about having to justify the function itself, here are some of the keywords in some ways of the charter, that needs to be created that helps people understand why sales enablement is needed, and whether it needs to be called that or not. We've seen it called so many different things, like sales effectiveness or field enablement or different aspects like that. Regardless of what you call it, it's just a way for to handle complexity. The world is so complex these days, and even more so. And there has to be some sort of mediary in there that allows for that facilitation, that collaboration, that conversation to happen, so that the goodness from each of these two groups can be realized.
Well, and I also, as I hear you speak, Catherine, when you think about it, and if this sort of bickering gets to the C level, they only care about one thing, and it's that word revenue. And it's popped up like 3 or 4 times now. And I think, there could be potentially something bonding, and Tashna is exactly landing on, I think we've heard revenue enablement, and marketers change brands and everything. So, it's like, if I had my choice, I think I'd Chris and Juliana and Catherine as revenue enablers versus sales enablers, as a way of maybe bridging this gap. So great, timely input there, Tashna.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We look at revenue enablement, and this is something that also was coined by Sirius, and a lot of the enablement platforms have been using it. And we have done a lot of work and what I call it more is like customer facing roles. So marketing does loads of customer facing stuff, right? That's pretty much the whole thing there. Sales, obviously, and then customer service or customer experience. And I think the customer is expecting a consistent, good experience across all of those different parts of your company. And if they're disparate and they're not connected, it's going to show up somewhere in that customer journey. And, how many of us, and I've done this, have gone through and been like, oh, this is cool. Like this new brand, I just found out about it. I'm going to go engage with them. I bought something from them, and then I have to follow up, and I have to get some sort of after service help. And it's just terrible. And, for me, it's like, and I'm out. Like, I don't need to deal with this in the amount of things that I have to do in my life. I'm not going to engage with them probably again. And I think there's something to be said, and we've heard this in large enterprise clients as well, right? The sales function, and then there's a delivery side, and it's like, well, I have to feel, and marketing's going, I don't understand why our sellers aren't selling the new stuff that we're supposed to be selling. And sales is going, delivery doesn't have my confidence for me to sell that thing, which is why I'm not selling that thing, which then circles you all the way up to the C-suite. And so all those different parts of a company have to be working well for the customer to have this experience, and for us to be revenue enablement potentially across those that whole span of a customer journey and then back again.
Well,
So there's so much here that I just kind of want to dive into. And there's the last thing that I'll say. I think the question that keeps coming up in my mind, but I don't say out loud, is as an executive, I think I would go, why do I have to have sales enablement if you're just bringing together two parts of the company that I already have? That is so frustrating to me. So you're telling me I need to invest in more people to do really the job of what I'm asking these other two departments to do. And I'll just kind of leave it there.
I think that's a great segue actually into the taking action aspect of it, because if we can't describe what we do in sales enablement, it probably would become very difficult to start to justify what happens. And these are more like local actions, I would say, the things that you can do next, but they are indicative of the value of that facilitative type of role that sales enablement can play. So maybe Juliana, you want to talk a little bit about some of these first ones?
Sure. I just have to tell everybody first is that a part of me wanted to put in parentheses after taking action. I'm sorry, it's not easier. These things aren't necessarily easy. And I think, you know, a lot of times we want them to be easier. People in our organizations would like them to be easier. And so understanding what it takes to be effective, I think, is the job of our leaders, and educating them so that they have a good perspective on that is our job. The other thing I'll say is that Tad had put most of these together, and it was primarily about what marketing does and what sales should be doing.
I was going to say, you guys invited me here, so I just can be a little bossy. I'm just the guest, right? But it's funny too, as I hear you talk. It's like the other thing too, just like in any community, I don't know, marriage, political, whatever, it's always about communication and the, you know, willingness to listen. And I think the reason I kind of loaded this up a little bit with more marketing things like a creative brief. I mean, I would think sellers would be tired of saying, "Oh God, why do they need a creative brief?" You know, but it's common in the marketing world as you're thinking of creating a campaign. You paint out scenarios, right, on the customer journey, and you picture these scenarios. Well, the sellers know far more scenarios than I think the marketing people have access to. So when you talk about creating a brief together, you know, it's marketing treating the seller almost like a customer themselves, and inviting them into the room and saying, "Look, we have this brand, but you know, tell us more about your scenarios." And then the brief that drives the work can be created collaboratively and include more of those things inherently versus as like a pain in the ass add-on later in the process when, you know, there's no resources to create these one-off situations.
Yeah, I think like inherently in all of these actions are, how do you do the work together instead of separately, and drive that alignment together, and then go and do the work that needs to be done and come back together again. And how do you feel good about iterating on the work that you're doing together instead of, I think the other sometimes problem for every side is that we maybe show up and we think that we have an expectation that, you know, the seller is going to expect us to be done with the thing that they need, instead of co-collaborating together on something, which I think is what we've seen is far more effective than trying to come and have the answer straight out of the gate. You know, creative brief is something that's been brought up a lot lately, and we've talked about it at Oxygen. It's like, well, I don't know what the heck a creative brief is. So if you keep saying creative brief and I don't know what it is, like, help me help you. Let's do one together. Let's actually, like, show me what the components are. Oh, we can talk about those, you know, and then that starts to really create a relationship. It starts to drive a consistency of language. It starts to uncover the things, you know, like marketers have such a language unto themselves, just like learning people have such a language, and business people have a language. And if we don't all try to understand one another's language and where we're coming from, then it's really hard to help one another.
Well, you know, I mean, and I think marketers too sometimes throw stuff over the fence and a seller gets it. And, you know, just to have something isn't as meaningful as understanding the why behind it. And I think if marketers could work a little bit harder to enroll and explain the why, then the sellers are going to own it a little bit more as well. And I'll just say one last thing, because I know we're time sensitive probably. We were talking about the C-level and saying, well, why do I need sales enablement? Well, I would push back to them. And I think, this is something, again, like I've been really focused on in the last couple of years, is that the C-levels are often partly to blame. And that's because they'll come up, as we talked early on, we're in the pivot mode, we're changing, we have a vision, let's go, come on, go. We need product, we need marketing, we need sales. But if you ask them what the vision is or what their narrative is, a lot of times they can't say it, or they don't, it's not common among all the different decision makers. So, it starts at the top. And when the narrative is clear, both marketers and sellers should demand that and actually understand it. And that narrative, actually, if it's the right one, shouldn't change throughout the process.
Yep. And with that, I think that's a great point, Tad, about how it starts at the top and how it can be so easy for somebody to have that vision in their head, but the articulation of it, and then ensuring that their direct reports are all on the same page and their direct reports are all on the same page is also, it's interesting because we're trying to do the same thing as sales enablement professionals. We're trying to get people on the same page. We're trying to understand those different requirements. So really appreciate those comments. We would love to take any questions that the group has. Put a question into the chat and we'll see if we can have a few minutes to answer it. I know that there's one question that I wanted to pose to you as you all are thinking about it, which is there's some common objections to this type of collaboration because it is new for a lot of folks, right? It's not in people's comfort zone. And, there's this kind of worry that what if it takes too long? What if it's too slow? What if it's too cumbersome to try and co-create something? Isn't it faster to just get something out there? And I'd like to hear what both of you have to say about that question while we're waiting for anything else to come in.
Well, I have a short answer, so I'll go first. If you go back to slide, what was it, 2 or 3, and show 65% of all content is wasted.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
There you go. It's like, there's no time. Well, we're not getting the impact or the results that we expect.
Yeah, I think my answer is very similar, where it's like, well, how many times do we ever do anything in a vacuum and it's super amazing, right? So yes, it can take more time, but typically the outcome is stronger and it works and it lasts, and then you can just iterate from there. But the first one out of the gate, you got to spend the time on it. Otherwise, it's a lot of wasted effort and money.
Like any prototype, I would guess. Great. Well, we were hoping to get done here in about 45 minutes for you folks to give you a few minutes to get back to whatever it is you're doing. We did have one final question here about the role of the sales enablement manager and why is it not very common in European countries?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paco. And I'm going to jump in on this one. So I have experience, as some of you know, I am on the board for the Sales Enablement Society, so I get to see across that. What many of you don't maybe know is that I'm also married to somebody who's European, so I get a different insight into what's happening in the different countries. And I've talked to some of our colleagues that are there, and yeah, Gail's in Canada, and she's going to have a perspective as well. I would say it's catching on, and it's just one of those things that's 5 to 8 years behind where the US is at. And it's not necessarily an answer that European countries would like to hear. So I'm highly cognizant of that as well. I think it is just, it's new. The US really dove into it pretty full force. And what I will say, though, that I think is interesting, I think you're going to see the growth across, especially those main countries, right? Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, it's going pretty strong. And I think it's going to just continue because the growth of the sales enablement professional is growing in the US. And we're coming to see senior sales enablement leaders mid-level senior sales enablement managers or individuals, and then junior sales enablement practitioners. So that's an evolution from just you know, the 4 or 5 years ago that the Sales Enablement Society was started. We had, I would say, mostly these mid-level managers, and now it's starting to break out into different categories. So I think that means that Europe is going to continue to grow and foster. And I also think the other thing that I would leave you with is just an education, right? Companies, if they don't know it exists, they don't know. And my guess is that there are lots of people doing sales enablement that are not called sales enablement. And so something that would be interesting from a consulting perspective is to see if you can go in and just map out where sales enablement is happening across the org. We've done this even with some companies that we work with in the US, because they know it's happening, but they don't know where and how much is done redundant or in a silo. And the maps you get out of that work are very fascinating.
Yep. Great. Thank you very much. That was a great, great answer. I would like to leave you with just our next webinar topic here, which, you know, when we can talk a little bit about like the role of sales enablement, but of course, if you cannot measure it, then it's very, very hard to demonstrate that value. So our next event, our next webinar is going to be about correlating business impact to proficiency. And of course, we are all looking to drive the proficiency of sellers, of customer service folks, other people, and modernizing that measurement strategy. Tricky yet doable is how I would say. So please look in the chat for the link. Just go ahead and sign up in advance so it's on your calendar, and we look forward to having you there at our next event. We'll be sending you these slides and via email with the session information. So thank you very much for attending our event today. Thank you to Juliana, to Tad. It's a great discussion, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Catherine.